I never imagined that moving to a new city would change my life so much. I'm Lucas, a regular guy, 28 years old, and a literature teacher. I was tired of the routine. I had lived my whole life in the same place, and as much as I loved my hometown, I felt like I needed something new, something that would make me breathe differently, see life in a new way. So, I packed my bags, closed the door behind me, and left. I ended up in a small town, full of friendly people, but with this laid-back vibe, the kind of place where time seems to move slower. I fell in love with it right away and thought, this is the place. I had a lot of adjustments to make. New job, new apartment, new everything. But I took it one step at a time, diving into my routine as a teacher. I started meeting people, but it wasn't until one particular day that things really began to change. It was at a coffee shop near the school where I first saw her, Jen. She was sitting by the window reading a book, completely absorbed in it. There was something about the way she was lost in the pages, her eyes moving across the text, that immediately drew me in. I couldn't explain it, but I found myself walking up to her. "Mind if I sit?" I asked, trying to sound casual even though I was a bit nervous. She looked up, smiled, and nodded. Of course. We started talking, and it felt like the most natural conversation in the world. She was intelligent, funny, and had this warmth that made you feel like you had known her forever. We spoke about books, our favorite authors, and our thoughts on life. It wasn't long before we started meeting regularly, and it felt effortless, like we were just meant to cross paths. A few weeks later, Jen and I were officially a couple. The connection between us was undeniable. She was smart, kind, and had this energy that made everything brighter. It didn't take long for me to realize that this was something special. We had similar values, similar goals, and, most importantly, we made each other happy. I hadn't even expected it to happen so fast, but there we were, starting something new, something real. I couldn't have asked for a better person to share this new chapter of my life with. Jen wasn't just a girlfriend. She felt like someone I had been waiting for, even though I didn't know it until that first conversation. At that point, I was feeling good about the move, about the change in my life. Things were looking up, and I was excited about where this new journey was headed. Little did I know, the calm I felt was just the calm before the storm. But for now, I was just happy. If I had known what was coming, I might have been more careful. But then again, sometimes it's better not to know. Sometimes you just have to go with the flow and let life take you where it will. It was supposed to be a casual dinner, just me, Jen, and my family. I had been looking forward to introducing her to everyone. I was excited. My family, though small, was important to me, and I wanted them to meet the woman who had quickly become a huge part of my life. I guess I should have known that things rarely go as planned. We gathered at my parents' house, the place I'd grown up. It was cozy, the smell of my mom's cooking filling the air as soon as I walked in. My mom was already fussing over everything, making sure the table was perfect, the food was just right. My dad, quiet as always, was watching the game in the living room. And Mark, my older brother, was there too, as always, a little too focused, on his phone. Jen looked a little nervous when we walked in. I could tell. She wasn't used to big family gatherings, but I reassured her with a quick smile and a soft squeeze of her hand. "It's just family. They'll love you," she smiled back. Though I could tell she wasn't convinced. She was shy, but I could see the way she tried to fit in, chatting with my mom as I helped with the dishes. Everything felt normal, easy, until Mark walked in. Mark had always been the one who never missed an opportunity to make things complicated. He was charismatic, sure, but there was always this underlying tension around him. He had this way of making everything about him. When he saw Jen, his face froze. I didn't catch it at first. He was just staring at her. Then it hit me. "Wait," Mark said, his voice suddenly colder than I was used to. "Jen?" Jen looked up, her smile faltering a little. Yeah? She looked confused, unsure of what was going on. Mark's eyes narrowed. You're the Jen? My stomach dropped. The way he said it. It wasn't a question. It was more like a challenge. Jen didn't know what he meant, but I did. I felt the room tense up. I'm not sure Jen started to say, but Mark cut her off, his voice rising a bit. You're my ex? Jen's eyes widened. Now she was really confused. We were together, but that was a long time ago. She looked at me for help, clearly uncomfortable. The tension in the room was thick. My mom, who had been eavesdropping in the kitchen, appeared at the door, wiping her hands on her apron. Mark was glaring at me now, clearly angry. You never told me this, he snapped, his eyes flashing with something I hadn't seen in a long time, jealousy. I can't believe you're with her. His tone had shifted, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Jen, trying to break the tension, softly said, Look, Mark, we're fine. I'm happy with Lucas. It's in the past, really. But Mark wasn't having it. No, he said firmly, his voice sharp. This isn't just some little thing from the past. You can't just move on like nothing happened. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I knew Mark could be intense, but I hadn't expected this. It was like he had flipped a switch, and suddenly, this casual dinner had turned into a battlefield. You're not welcome here, Mark said, pointing at Jen now, his anger obvious. You should have never come. I won't stand by and watch this. I was furious. I felt my blood boil. How dare he? How dare he try to control my relationship like this? My heart was racing, my hands clenched into fists. But I couldn't let him get away with it. I stepped in, my voice calm but firm. Mark, that's enough. Jen is here with me because I want her here. You don't get to tell me what I should or shouldn't do. Mark smirked, like he was daring me to take it further. You'll regret this, Lucas. She's not the right one for you. Jen looked at me, clearly uncomfortable with everything that had happened. I could see the hurt in her eyes. It was the first real crack in our perfect little world. I hated it. After dinner, I tried to shake off the bad vibes, but it wasn't easy. Mark hadn't even apologized. Instead, he'd made it clear that he wasn't happy with me being with Jen. I couldn't understand why he cared so much. He'd moved on. Why couldn't I? I tried to talk to Jen afterward, but I could tell she was still processing everything. I didn't know it was going to be like this, she said softly. I didn't want to cause problems between you two. I shook my head. It's not your fault, Jan. He's always been like that. And I'm not going to let him get in the way of what we have. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. Something had been broken. Mark's words, his attitude, it all weighed on me more than I wanted to admit. That night, as Jen and I sat on the couch, I held her hand and promised her, I'm not going to let him tear us apart. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. Would it be that easy to push him out of the picture? In the days after that awkward dinner, things felt different. Tension lingered in the air, especially when it came to Mark. His words kept replaying in my mind. You'll regret this, Lucas. I tried to brush it off, but it had gotten under my skin more than I cared to admit. Mark and I had always had a complicated relationship, but this time it felt like he had crossed a line. Jen, on the other hand, was trying her best to stay positive. She kept telling me she didn't mind what happened, that she understood the history between Mark and me. But I could see the doubt in her eyes every time we talked about it. She wasn't used to being in the middle of something so messy, and neither was I. I hated seeing her uncomfortable, especially when all I wanted was for her to feel at home with me and my family. But as much as I wanted to fix things, I had to focus on what mattered the most, Jen and me. I wasn't going to let my brother's issues with her tear us apart. It wasn't long before I started to think about the future. Our future. One night, while we were sitting on my couch, Jen curled up next to me with her head on my shoulder. I made a decision. I had been thinking about it for a while, but that night, the idea felt right. "Jen," I started, my voice soft but certain, "I think we should take the next step. I want to be with you forever." She looked up at me, her eyes wide with surprise. "What do you mean?" she asked, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. But I could see the nerves behind her eyes. "I want to marry you," I said, my words coming out all at once, as if they had been building up inside me for months. "I know it's fast, but I can't imagine my life without you. I want to make this official." Jen's eyes softened, and she sat up, her hands gently holding mine. "Are you sure?" Her voice trembled, but there was a warmth in it, a sense of hope. "We've been through a lot already, and I don't want you to feel like you're rushing into something." I shook my head, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "No, I'm sure. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. I love you, Jen. I want to be with you. Forever." She looked at me for a long moment, her face filled with emotion. And then finally she smiled. Really smiled, and nodded. "Yes," she said softly. "Yes, I'll marry you." We kissed then, and, for a moment, everything felt perfect. All the doubts, the tension with Mark, the uncertainty of the future, they all faded away. All that mattered was us, here, together. But little did I know, that was only the beginning. The next few weeks were a blur of excitement, but also a growing sense of dread. Mark wasn't the kind of guy who would let things slide. I knew he'd react. He had to. It was like he could never be happy unless he was in control, and the thought of me marrying Jen was probably driving him insane. I tried not to think about it too much, but it was hard not to. The last thing I wanted was another confrontation with him, especially not over something as important as this. But I knew that was exactly what was coming. Mark wasn't the type to sit back and accept things quietly. Jen and I kept the engagement between us for a while, savoring the happiness of the moment, but eventually, we knew we couldn't hide it forever. One evening, I called my parents and invited them over for a casual dinner. I wanted to tell them. I wanted to share the good news before Mark found out from someone else. But what happened next was nothing like I expected. The moment Mark walked through the door, I could see the look on his face. It was a mix of surprise and something darker. He didn't even greet Jen. Instead, he went straight to me, his eyes narrowing as if he already knew what was coming. "You've got to be kidding." "Me," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You're really going to do this?" I tried to stay calm, though I could feel my anger bubbling up. "Yes, Mark, I am. I love her, and I want to spend the rest of my life with her." Mark scoffed, shaking his head. "This is insane, Lucas. You're letting her ruin everything. Do you even realize what you're doing?" Jen stood there looking more and more uncomfortable as Mark's words hit harder than I think anyone expected. It was like he was purposely trying to provoke her, trying to make her feel small. I stepped in before it could get worse. "That's enough, Mark. I'm not going to stand here and let you talk to Jen like that. This is our decision, and I'm not backing down." The room was heavy with tension. My mom, trying to mediate, stepped in with a forced smile, but it was clear even she was nervous. "Mark, we're just happy for you two," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "We should be celebrating, not fighting." But Mark wasn't having it. He turned to Jen, his face now twisted with frustration. "You really think you can just waltz into this family and take everything I had? You think you can just take my place?" Jen, who had been quiet for most of this, finally spoke up, her voice shaky but firm. "Mark, I didn't come here to cause problems. I just want to be with Lucas." Mark glared at her. "Well, too bad. You should have thought about that before you started dating my brother. I felt my stomach twist. I was furious, but I didn't want to give him the satisfaction of seeing me lose control. But this was different. This was no longer about me and Jen. It was about Mark's jealousy, his need to have things his way, and I wasn't going to let him win. Jen and I are getting married, I said, my voice unwavering, and nothing you say is going to change that. The silence that followed was thick. It was like the air had become so heavy that even breathing felt difficult. I could see the anger in Mark's eyes, but I didn't back down. I wasn't going to let him destroy what we had. Not now, not ever. The evening was supposed to be a peaceful gathering, a moment to celebrate family and enjoy each other's company. But, as with many things in my life lately, it quickly spiraled into something I wasn't prepared for. Jen and I had been dating for several months now, and I had never felt more certain about anything. She was everything I had ever wanted, smart, funny, kind, and I knew I wanted to spend my life with her. So, when I decided to invite her to a family dinner, I thought it would be the perfect opportunity to show everyone just how serious I was about her. But, as soon as we walked into the living room, the tension was palpable. Mark was already there, sitting on the couch with a drink in his hand, his eyes narrowing when he saw Jen. I could tell something wasn't right, but I brushed it off, figuring it was just the usual awkwardness that came with family gatherings. We all exchanged pleasantries, and I tried my best to ease the tension in the room, but I could feel Mark's eyes on Jen every time she spoke. There was something off about the way he was looking at her, something that made my skin crawl. I should have known then that the night was going to take a turn for the worse. After dinner, as we all sat around the table sipping wine and making small talk, Mark suddenly cleared his throat, his voice cutting through the conversation like a knife. "I don't know if I should be saying this," he began, his tone low and serious. "But I can't ignore the fact that Jen is my ex." The room fell silent. Everyone stopped talking, and I could see the shock on Jen's face as the words hit her like a ton of bricks. "Mark, what are you talking about?" I asked, my heart racing. I felt a mix of confusion and anger boiling up inside me. "What do you mean, your ex?" Jen looked at me, her expression a mixture of disbelief and discomfort. I could tell she didn't want to talk about the past, but Mark wasn't letting it go. He was stirring the pot, looking for a reaction. "It's true," Mark said, leaning back in his chair as if he were enjoying the discomfort he was causing. "Jen and I were together for a long time before she ended things with me, and now here she is, with my brother." He looked directly at me. "I just think it's strange, that's all." The room seemed to shrink as Mark's words hung in the air. Jen was frozen, not knowing how to respond. My anger was rising, and I could feel the tension between us growing thicker by the second. "Mark, stop," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, though it was shaking with frustration. "This isn't the time or the place to dredge up old relationships. Jen and I are together now, and that's all that matters." But Mark wasn't finished. He turned his gaze to Jen, his eyes narrowing. "I don't know if I can just sit here and pretend everything's fine," he said, his voice rising with each word. "You think you can just walk away from what we had and move on to my brother? Don't you think that's a little messed up?" Jen's face flushed with embarrassment, and I could see tears welling up in her eyes. She was trying to hold it together, but I could tell she was struggling. This wasn't just about me or Mark anymore. It was about Jen feeling cornered, uncomfortable, and hurt in front of everyone. I stood up, my chair scraping against the floor. "Enough," I said, my voice sharp. "This is not how we handle things. I don't care about your past, Mark, but you need to respect Jen and me. You can't keep acting like this." Mark sneered at me, his anger only growing. "I'm just saying what everyone's thinking," he shot back. "You're blind, Lucas. You don't see what's really going on here. But I'm not going to stand by and watch this train wreck happen." The room was tense, and I could feel the heat rising between us. But just as I thought things couldn't get worse, Mark turned to Jen and said something that took me by surprise. "You know," he began, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "I still care about you. I never really stopped. So I guess I should ask—" Before he could finish his sentence, he got down on one knee. The sudden movement caught everyone off guard, and the room seemed to freeze. My heart skipped a beat as I watched him pull out a small velvet box from his pocket. "Jen," he said, looking up at her with a smirk, "will you marry me?" The shock was instant. Jen's face went pale, her mouth opening and closing as she tried to process what was happening. I could feel my blood boiling, but I couldn't move. I was stunned. Here we were, at what was supposed to be a peaceful family dinner, and Mark had turned it into a spectacle. A cruel, calculated spectacle. Jen didn't say anything at first. She just stared at him, wide-eyed, unable to comprehend the audacity of what was happening. I felt a wave of protectiveness wash over me, and before I could stop myself, I blurted out, "Jen, don't say anything! Don't let him do this to you!" Mark didn't even look at me. He was too focused on Jen, waiting for her response. But Jen, to her credit, found her voice. She shook her head slowly, her eyes locked on Mark. "No, Mark," she said softly but firmly. "I'm not marrying you. I'm with Lucas now, and I'm not going back to the past." I could see the relief in Jen's eyes as she spoke those words, and my heart swelled with pride. She wasn't going to let Mark's manipulation control her. She was strong, and in that moment, she proved it. Mark, however, wasn't so willing to accept it. He stood up, the box still in his hand, and glared at me. "You think you've won, don't you?" he spat. "But you haven't. This is far from over." The tension in the room reached a breaking point, and it was clear that no one knew how to handle the situation. I looked at Jen, and she gave me a small, reassuring smile. Despite everything, we were standing strong together. But I knew things weren't going to be the same after this. Mark had shown his true colors, and now I had to protect the woman I loved from the fallout. The dinner had barely ended when the storm that was Mark's proposal began to settle. Jen and I left the table as quickly as we could, needing to escape the tension that clung to the air like smoke. I could feel the weight of the evening pressing down on me, and all I wanted was to get Jen home and away from Mark's twisted theatrics. But just as we were about to leave, I felt a hand on my shoulder. I turned to see my mother standing behind me, her face drawn with concern. I could see the worry in her eyes, but there was something else there. Something I wasn't prepared for. "Lucas, we need to talk," she said, her voice low and urgent. I glanced at Jen, who nodded, giving me the space to talk to my mom alone. As I followed her into the living room, I had a bad feeling in the pit of my stomach. I could tell that this conversation wasn't going to be easy. Once we were alone, my mom didn't waste any time. She got straight to the point. "You need to reconsider your decision," she said, her tone more firm than I had ever heard before. "You can't just go ahead with this marriage to Jen, not after what happened tonight. Don't you see? Mark still loves her. You can't just ignore that." I blinked, caught off guard by her words. "Mom, what are you talking about?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm, but I could already feel the anger bubbling up. "Mark isn't a child anymore. He doesn't get to control who I love or who Jen loves." She shook her head, her face a mixture of concern and frustration. "No, Lucas, you don't understand. Mark has always been in love with Jen, and tonight you saw it. He's not just going to walk away from her that easily. This isn't something you can just push aside, and neither can she." I felt my chest tighten. "So, what are you saying? That I should just cancel the wedding and let Mark have her, after everything that's happened?" My mother's face softened, but only slightly. "I'm not saying that, but I'm asking you to think about this. Mark's my son, and he's been through so much. He's never gotten over Jen, and you're asking him to just accept this. It's not fair to him. I can't just stand by and watch you marry her, knowing how much it hurts. Him? I was speechless. It was like the ground beneath me had shifted and I wasn't sure how to stand anymore. My own mother, the woman who had always been my biggest supporter, was asking me to reconsider my future with Jen because of Mark's feelings. I love Jen, Mom, I said, my voice shaking with emotion. I'm not going to let Mark or anyone else dictate my happiness. This is my life, my decision. Her eyes filled with something that looked like desperation. But Lucas, you're asking me to choose between you and Mark. If you marry Jen, I don't know if I can be there. I just can't. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. My own mother was threatening not to attend my wedding because she couldn't accept the fact that I was choosing Jen over Mark. It didn't make sense. I thought maybe this was a moment of panic for her, a mother who didn't want to see her son hurt. But it was more than that. She truly believed I was making a mistake. I felt a wave of disbelief wash over me. You're saying you won't come to my wedding? Over Mark? She didn't respond immediately, but her silence spoke volumes. Her eyes avoided mine, and for the first time I realized just how much she was caught in Mark's web. She didn't want to lose him, and somehow I was the one who was supposed to fix everything. But that wasn't my responsibility. It couldn't be. I can't make you understand, Lucas, she whispered, her voice barely audible. But I can't be part of this. I won't. I felt the weight of her ultimatum settle over me like a suffocating blanket. It was too much, too soon, and I didn't know how to process it. My mother was asking me to choose between her and Jen, but it wasn't just a choice between two people. It was about the life I wanted to build, the future I saw for myself. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I can't do that, Mom, I said, my voice quiet but firm. I can't put Mark before Jen. She's the one I'm going to spend my life with. If you can't accept that, then I guess we'll have to figure this out on our own. Her face twisted in pain, but there was no changing her mind. The damage was done, and I knew that, in her heart, she wasn't going to come to terms with my choice anytime soon. But this was my life, and no matter what, I couldn't let her or anyone else make me second-guess my decision. I turned to walk away, but before I could reach the door, she called out one last time. You'll regret this, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The hurt in her voice echoed in my mind, but I knew there was no other path for me now. I had made my choice, and nothing, no matter how much it hurt, was going to change that.